This podcast right here is just for entertainment purposes. I am not a medical doctor, not a nutritionist, or a personal trainer. I am barely fucking qualified to operate a toaster. As Ruth Lane Morso wisely said, I don't know shit about fuck. So don't trust me, don't listen to me. We're here just for shits and giggles. And if you trust me with health advice, then that's just natural selection at work. Don't do drugs, always listen to your GP. And with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get started. Welcome to episode 12 of the OptiCast, the Optimization Lab podcast with me, Nathan.
And me, Aubrey.
Where we discuss enhancing all facets of the human experience. Before we dive in, I just wanted to say thank you to all of you who's been turning in, sharing clips, and leaving comments. The OptiCast is growing, and it's really all because of your support. If you enjoyed these deep and nuanced conversations, hit subscribe and drop a like so more people can discover the show. Today's guest is someone who's redefined what evidence-based really means in the fitness world. Ella, better known as the Scientific Snitch, is a researcher, coach, and educator who built a massive following by breaking down complex physiology into plain, practical insights, and by fearlessly calling out the nonsense that spreads across the fitness space. She holds a BS in exercise science, is completing her master's in physiology, and has direct laboratory experience studying insulin signaling and metabolic adaptation. Ella's work blends scientific literacy with real-world application, tackling everything from muscle growth and fat loss to hormones, seed oils, and detox fads, always with sharp humor and brutal honesty. Her controversial stance that we'll tackle today, that you don't need a caloric surplus to build muscle. For some, that's science, and for others, it's more of heresy. Today, we're going to explore how she arrived at that conclusion, the research behind it, and how it applies to everyone from lifestyle lifters to enhanced athletes chasing 70 extra pounds of lean mass. Ella, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. And that was such a nice introduction. It feels kind of, I don't know. I'm always the kind of person who thinks that there's always someone in the room smarter than me. So I don't think I would have, you would never catch me dead saying all that about myself. But
yeah, that's the way it should go.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we get into the technical things, I was just wondering what pulled you towards research and translating that research to the public. Like, was there a point in which you realized that misinformation, the problem that was there wasn't just the lack of studies, but like the lack of people understanding them? Like, how did this work for you?
So the person who got me into research also unironically got me into content creation. So I knew somebody she was one of the closest people to me when I was growing up. She was like a caretaker to me. So like when my mom was at work, she would be the one that's babysitting me. Her name, well, I don't know if I want to say her name, but she had pancreatic cancer in my undergrad. And as she started losing more and more weight and getting more and more cachetic, she began looking for solutions because cachexia it's a wasting condition, which means that your muscles basically shrink. They pretty much eat themselves. We don't really know all the mechanisms yet. But basically, when she was going through some of the more aggressive parts of cachexia, where she was losing like 10, like 15 pounds, struggling to get upstairs, she would go online and she would like try to find things that she could potentially do to help because there's no medication for cachexia, no like direct treatment for it, at least in the United States. Or at least anything approved for it, and really anything that really works. So she was looking for good information, but when you look up diet and cancer, it's like a crap show. It's so much horrible information out there. So there was one time when she took me up to her room, and she was giving me clothes, and she was saying, "I'm not going to need this one day." I'm like, that's extremely depressing. And she goes, "Well, I would need them if only there was a good place to find information because I don't know where to go." And that was one of the things that kind of kicked me into wanting to start doing videos. One of my first videos was on like the vegan diet and curing cancer or something like that. And that's what kind of started the whole misinformation, like trying to tackle that. Then as I got into misinformation, I began reading more and more papers. I became more and more fascinated with actual research. And so I reached out to a bunch of laboratories around campus. I managed to land a spot into one. And the individual who mentored me kind of got me into it. He got me hooked. And I was like, I wish I could be a scientist, but don't scientists do a lot of math? I really hate math. And he goes, "No, I never do math." And that's what kind of sealed the deal. And yeah, I hate, like, I love my friends in physics. I have 2 friends who work in a particle accelerator, or at least 1 friend who works in a particle accelerator. Another one is like this really like good quantum physics. I digress. I don't like physics. I don't like calculus. So if I could get away with not doing that in graduate school, then I would jump headfirst into graduate school. And so that's what I did. And unironically, I'm also studying the disease that my caregiver had. I'm like trying not to say her name out loud, but like
Yeah,
that's
Yeah.
yeah. Nice.
yeah.
That's a nice story, man. That's very, very inspiring. And
Mhm.
so let's continue setting up the stage here. You've basically debated everyone from influencers to people who actually have PhDs. I'm wondering what, in your opinion, makes it for a productive discussion instead of just
Mhm.
a pointless conversation when it comes to the topic.
Speaking of that, I do need to post that one video because I had a debate with somebody who is a PhD student on bulking and cutting, and I have yet to edit it down because
Oh, nice.
I am so, oh God.
Okay, not
I
nice.
just I'm really bad at editing, and it's like a 2-hour long conversation. I digress.
Yeah.
So the way that I broke it down was I basically did a mini literature review because when I first started looking into this topic, I actually was more biased towards thinking bulking would work, which is why the majority of the studies that I've read were literally just on surplus versus surplus group, or surplus versus non-surplus group, or like the prospect of having an energy surplus, and rather than like having an energy maintenance. Granted, there's not a lot of literature on maintenance, like maintenance and exercise, but I was a little more biased towards bulking because at that time I tried my first bulk. I did it already. So it was like something that I wish would work, because if it doesn't work, then I just wasted like literally a year of my life. So that's what got me started reading it. And when I started reading into it, it became very aware. Well, at least I became very aware of how poor the literature was in terms of supporting it. Um, and that's kind of what got me down that path. And now I have a little mini video that I'm still, again, in the process of editing. I freaking hate editing, but it literally has all of those studies that I looked through and is like a mini literature review.
Okay.
Oh,
Okay.
interesting.
Nice. So let's start like part by part with that. When you talk about maintenance, what does that mean biologically, and why isn't that just like a static number, or why does it encompass more things than some people seem to think that it should encompass, and things like that?
Yeah, so on the bare bones basics of it, it's not as simple as uh, eat more than what you like, eat more than your quote unquote maintenance, and then the scale goes up. Like, weight is not just one thing. Weight
Mhm.
is your body fat, weight is your skeletal muscle, and that is really important to acknowledge because the amount of muscle, or the amount of calories needed to build muscle, is different from the amount of calories needed to build more fat.
Mhm.
So you can build muscle and lose fat. That should already tell you that a surplus isn't really necessary to gain muscle, because if you're able to gain muscle weight while losing fat weight, there's something interesting going on there that you kind of need to acknowledge. And the traditional understanding of maintenance, where it's just you're maintaining the same body weight, doesn't take that into account because it lumps fat and muscle all into the same category.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
And when we get to this conversation, I think we can just be a little bit more clear on for the audience on what is it that when we're talking about like calories, for instance, we usually treat weight gain all of the same, right? But the building muscle and storing fat, they aren't the same process as you just alluded to. Can you explain a little bit about what's the energy cost of creating muscle tissue and how that differs from gaining fat, and why that even matters when we're talking about growing without a surplus?
Yeah, so the basic idea of eating in, I guess I should really start with like what your daily expenditure is, because at the bottom, at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. Because what a lot of people consider bulking is eating more than what you're expending throughout the day. When you do eat more than what you expend throughout the day, that's also including exercise. That's including shivering. That's including like me moving my hands all over the place, because that's all a part of what you expend throughout the day. If one of those processes, for example, moving my hand towards a weight and then picking it up, if one of those processes causes my body to build muscle, well, now I just added even more onto what I'm expending. So when you're saying, yeah, eat more than what you're expending, okay, you're counting all of that into your expenditure and you're eating more than that. Where are those calories going towards? They're going to be stored as fat, because that's physiologically what fat is for. Um, so I guess when we're talking about like what we consider surplus, what we consider a deficit, it really is referring to the accrual and loss of body fat. It's not so the maintenance of body fat. Like nobody's saying, yeah, I'm going to maintain body fat on this bulk. Because if that were the case, then there would be no need for this discussion. Everybody would already be doing the classic main gaining. You're not gaining and losing body fat, but people are, meaning they're eating more than what their body needs to put on muscle.
And when we're having this conversation, we like there's four terms that I think are very complicated for people, and I just wanted you to break down, just connecting the dots here between fat cell turnover and muscle remodeling. That would be lipogenesis, lipolysis, hypertrophy, and hypoplasia. And why these mechanisms even show that the surplus model that we're so used to is just a little bit too black and white to explain like all of these things.
Yeah, sure. So I guess the first thing would be differentiating between hypertrophy and hyperplasia, because muscle cells and fat cells can both do this, but we only see hypertrophy in muscle cells, but we can see both hyperplasia and hypertrophy in fat cells. And the reason for this is kind of physiological. It's mainly because when you have when you run out of things to store into, so in fat cells, like a fat cell can only get oh so big. Once it gets too big, you're going to need more fat cells. And that's where there's these things called fat cell progenitors. They're basically like little baby fat cells. And when they differentiate, you get new fat cells. And that's hyperplasia, because you're making more. Hypertrophy is when the cell itself gets bigger. So I kind of already alluded to this, but a fat cell can only get oh so big. So once you get to a certain size, you need more fat cells, and that's where hyperplasia comes in. With muscle cells, there's kind of there's a little bit of a physiological limit. Like we're not just gonna infinitely grow muscle until we like stop living. The main reason for that is because at a certain point, women go through menopause, men have testosterone, that drops off. You can't just build infinite amounts of muscle. There's also I don't think this is very well established, but I'm pretty sure there's a good genetic limit without the use of gear. So it's a little bit different with muscle mass. You can only gain as much as you can stimulate to grow. You can't just pack on more muscle because you're forcing more food down your throat, because if that were the case, there would be no such thing as obesity. So muscle just hypertrophies. It just gets bigger. And the way it does that is through these cells that are called satellite cells, but they basically satellite on the edge of the muscle cell. That's why they're called satellite cells. And they donate nuclei. They can repair the muscle cell or the muscle fiber, because that's what a muscle cell is. And as a satellite cell donates nuclei, that muscle cell has more of a capacity to build muscle proteins. And those muscle proteins help that muscle contract harder and harder. And that's the process of what progressive overload does. So we're looking at two types of tissues, one that has hyperplasia and hypertrophy donating to its size, one that only has hypertrophy donating to its size. And then when we look at the mechanisms of those, so on the fat cell side, fat cells will get bigger and get smaller through lipogenesis and lipolysis. Lipolysis or lysis is like, that's the end part of the word. That means breaking down. So lipolysis is breaking down fats, and that's being used for energy. So when you're in a calorie deficit, you stimulate lipolysis. And then with lipogenesis, genesis being built up, or create, you're creating more fat. So when you eat too many calories, you're stimulating lipogenesis. And that's like your storage mechanism to store that extra energy away for a rainy day. For muscle tissue, it's a little different. So when you're in a surplus, yes, you can build up fat around muscle tissue, and that actually makes it lower quality. It makes it weaker. It makes it less capable of contracting. So that's why individuals with really severe obesity or individuals who are overweight or pushing the upper limits of what is healthy, you'll see their muscle quality go down. And even though they may be stronger in the like total absolute sense of the word, they're always going to be weaker than their leaner counterparts because their muscle just isn't as high quality. And that's because fat has built up around the muscle. But muscle can also store glycogen, which is just immediately used for energy. So you're constantly cycling through glycogen. And that's a little bit different than what we see with fat cells, where you're storing energy away for a later day. Muscle tissue doesn't really do that. It uses the energy right away. And if it is storing it up for that rainy day, that makes the muscle tissue lower quality. It doesn't make it as strong and as good. So then as far as like energy storage, man, I'm making sure that I go through this properly. So lipogenesis and lipolysis are the processes that build up and break down fat in fat cells. Protein synthesis, glyconeogenesis, and glycolysis are the processes that build up and break down the molecules inside of muscle that can be used for energy. You don't want to have a protein degradation. That's when you're getting smaller and you're wasting away. Like that's something you see in higher degrees in like sarcopenic individuals, individuals who are a lot older and are losing muscle. That's not a good thing. Glycolysis is a good thing, and that happens during exercise when you're moving your muscles, but glyconeogenesis and glycolysis don't necessarily contribute to that long-term muscle growth that we want and that we want to have with resistance training. That's more so protein synthesis. Mm-hmm. And so I guess those are the differences between the mechanisms and the processes and how they relate to each other. I hope that's good enough.
No, that's perfect. That's perfect. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
I'm learning so much.
Let's you having
I
fun?
want to take biology again.
So let's jump into the actual like conversation itself, right? So do we need a surplus to grow? What is it that the current evidence say, and where do you think is the point where people misinterpret this?
I think so. When people say, do you need a surplus to grow? Do you need a surplus to get fat? Yes, you do. Do you need a surplus to build muscle? No, because if that were the case, then body recomposition just would not be a thing. Individuals who are obese would not be able to gain muscle as they lose body fat. And individuals who are even normal weight, like myself, I wouldn't be able to be gaining muscle while I'm losing body fat. My partner's doing that right now where he's in a deficit. And as long as you have enough energy to push yourself hard in the gym, you're giving your muscles that tension, that pulling force that it needs to stimulate more protein synthesis. And if you have enough protein, well, you're going to build that muscle regardless of how much or how little like actual dietary fat you have in your diet. So given that carbohydrates and proteins are staying relatively the same, and you're getting enough that you need to stimulate protein synthesis, then you're going to get protein synthesis. There's no question about that. With lipogenesis and lipolysis, that only comes when you have an excess amount of energy that your body does not know what to do with, or when you have too little energy where your body needs to break it down so that way it can have the energy for those essential functions. So when people say, do I need a surplus to grow which tissue? Because that makes all the world a difference. And most people, when they say they want to grow, most of the time they're referring to muscle. They're not referring to fat. So if you're trying to put yourself into that surplus where you're gaining a specific amount of weight on the scale every week, and you're not paying as much attention to your gym progress, then yeah, you're going to build muscle regardless because you are still lifting. But would it be as good as if you were just eating as much as you need and not focusing so heavily on pushing the scale weight higher and higher and higher? Because as I said, fat can build up around muscle tissue, And when you get to those upper limits where you're starting to look fluffy, that's not good for your muscle growth anymore.
What would you consider the looking of like fluffy for like a man?
I think that depends on a lot of things because it depends on where you store fat primarily. So if you
Mhm.
store a lot of visceral fat, I would argue that you should stay leaner, like regardless of how quote unquote lean you look. If you gain a lot of visceral fat, that's probably not a good thing. So if you start
Like
to gain
10% or like 15% lean?
that, it's different for different people. So you would have to pay attention to blood labs too,
Hmm.
because visceral fat tends to affect things like, for example, your heart health.
Hmm.
So when you're trying to determine whether or not a certain body fat percentage is healthy for you, I would look at how are you performing in the gym? Are you constantly out of breath? Do your blood labs look good when you go to the doctor? Those are the sorts of things that, like, if your doctor is telling you that, yeah, your triglycerides and your lipid panel looks like hell, you're constantly out of breath, you could have a six pack still because that's not where you genetically hold fat. But if you have a ton of visceral fat, maybe your legs are super fluffy, still wouldn't say that that's healthy for you.
Hmm.
So it
Hmm.
kind of depends from person to person, but generally speaking, I'm pretty sure the range is somewhere between 8 and 15% body fat for men, and then 15 to 25% body fat for women, from what I remember.
Hmm. Yeah, it's usually about like 10% more for women. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So one of the pushbacks that I see people giving here is that some of the studies that we have, right? So, for instance, the 800 calorie bariatric patient studies, like we have people who are basically untrained or overweight individuals, and then how is it that we extrapolate to, let's say, a lean, well trained, perhaps enhanced lifter? Like, how is it that um, do they become so much of a completely different type of being that these things have nothing to add there? That they have this like new type of muscle growth, like they have muscle hyperplasia and all these things, or is it just that is just to a different degree?
So there's one that video got a lot of attention because it was posted right after my viral video. However, there is another study that was on resistance trained individuals that I've brought up since then. I'm trying to find here. Let me quickly leave the page. I hope that this doesn't. Can you guys still see me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So resistance trained. Uh,
By the
so
way, I love that you let you like check your notes and that you're like unapologetic about checking your notes and stuff, because it's like I've heard people saying things like, "Oh, you just read a teleprompter and stuff," and I'm like, "Bro, have you ever met a professor speaking at a conference? Like ever? They know their shit, but you have to like make sure that you get all of your points." So I really appreciate that, actually.
yeah, I don't pretend like I learned
What
this very
about memory?
quickly in like in research is you're never the smartest person in the room, so never pretend like you are. Um,
Hmm.
always think that there's something to learn. But that being said, I did learn from this study, and it was a very good study. It's from 2021, so fairly recent, but it's called Flexible versus Rigid Dieting in Resistance Trained Individuals Seeking to Optimize Their Physiques. It was a randomized controlled trial by Conlon et al. And it's in the Journal of International Society, the Journal of International Society of Sports Nutrition. Both groups lost fat and gained muscle in this study. So if gaining muscle was impossible to do in a deficit for resistance trained individuals who are eating a deficit, resistance training, all that other fun stuff, then this study just would not exist. But it does. And it's a really good study. It demonstrates that individuals who are living either a flexible or a rigid diet, they can be equally effective for weight loss. However, the fat-free mass gains, i.e. muscle gains, were greater in the flexible dieting group. So if you're in a slightly lesser calorie deficit where you're allowing yourself to have a little bit more freedom, you're more than likely going to feel better. And if you feel better, you're going to push yourself harder in the gym. If you push yourself harder in the gym, you're going to gain more muscle, because at the end of the day, it's about protein and adequate energy, not going so high in the amount of energy you're consuming that you're storing it as fat.
I don't remember the name of the study, but you probably do. The last one, I think it was Hanselman's study that was basically comparing the, the maintenance to the small surplus and the large surplus, I believe like 15% or whatnot. And when I was looking at that study, you could still see that the group that had a larger surplus had a little bit, though not significant, but they had a little bit more than the previous group. And I was wondering, because of what you just said, that like, oh, perhaps because your deficit was a little bit less significant, you had more energy, so an indirect effect on this. Do you think there's something to this?
So actually, that only holds true if you cherry pick for figure F, which is the biceps muscle thickness. If you look at any of the other 6 muscles that were evaluated, the high surplus group actually underperforms in a few of them. One of them notably being the lateral vastus lateralis. I'm like backwards today, but the vastus lateralis and the rectus femoris muscle thickness, both of them, and I'm just making sure that I get this correct here. Yes, both of them, in all technicality, they outperformed. So the maintenance group outperformed the high surplus group for the fastest lateral. It says lateral VI. That's why I'm keep on saying that. Vastus lateralis and the rectus femoris. I can also probably look at another one here. Let's see. Oh yeah, and the biceps muscle thickness for the maintenance group outperformed the moderate surplus group. So the heterogeneity, which basically just means the mixed results here, considering the fact that there was at the bottom line, there was no difference between all 3 groups in terms of like how much muscle they actually grew. You could cherry pick any one of these graphs to say, oh yeah, but the high surplus group did better on the biceps muscle thickness. Okay, but what about the other 5 muscles they measured? Because there were 2 other muscles that they measured where the maintenance group outperformed the high surplus group. So was it just the participants' genetics, or was it actually the surplus that did that? And I really liked this study because it's unlike that one from 2002. I believe it's the Rosnick 2002, where the high surplus group actually lost body fat because they didn't measure things correctly in terms of how they didn't measure body composition correctly. In contrast with the Eric Helm study, they actually did a pretty good, like they used skin fold measurements, which if done properly, they can be pretty reasonable. They're a lot better than like a bod pod or I believe it was like water impedance or something, where it's a lot more variable, especially if you're not taking proper measures to account for it. And since that study was not, they weren't trying to evaluate bulking versus maintenance or versus a slightly lower calorie. They were evaluating 2 supplements. Because that wasn't their primary outcome. They weren't as specific with how they were measuring body composition. With Eric Helm's study, they were, and it clearly shows that maintenance did not gain fat. High surplus gained a lot more fat. Moderate gained slightly less fat than high. Like I really like the way that study was put out. But at the end of the day, if you cherry pick specific figures from the muscle thickness graph, you can twist it in a way to make it seem like bulking is better, but in reality, you're choosing 1 figure out of 6.
Do you think there could be perhaps for some individuals the indirect effect of, say, just not stressing about the diet? But let's say that they're not going like to McDonald's and having Rice Krispies treats with like every meal. But let's just say that they were leading the target, to use Todd's term here, by, let's say, 50 calories a day. And right now they're doing so by about 200 calories a day. It's overall the course of a year, it's going to make a pretty significant difference. But let's say they start at 8% body fat, they're going to end up at, let's call it 15 instead of 13%. So not like massive difference. Do you think that could be something that's like a specific case in which someone could benefit from just having a little bit more of a loose approach to the dieting for the purpose of accumulating more muscle tissue?
Well, here's the difference between that and the flexible versus rigid dieting study that I just cited a little bit earlier. The flexible versus rigid dieting was in individuals in a deficit. They weren't gaining fat. And so when you're comparing that to somebody who they're eating extra calories that is leading them to gain fat, what is the benefit of gaining fat for building muscle? There is no physiological evidence of it. If anything, there's physiological evidence against it because the accrual of fat inside of muscle tissue harms the quality, harms the contractile like properties of that muscle tissue. It also in some instances can decrease insulin sensitivity, but I hesitate to say that because exercise can counteract that effect. It's more so an effect on leptin, but that's another conversation. But the idea is that there's nothing that physiologically suggests that gaining fat is giving an edge to somebody who's eating at maintenance. And arguably, you can have a really flexible diet at maintenance. You can go out once a week
Oh
and
yeah.
have a burger, and it's not a big deal. The only difference is one person's having a burger 3 times a week while the other person's having it once.
But what I mean is not so much of a physiological difference, but like an actual psychological reason. So let's say that for the psychology of that person, if they can just act as if their diet is not like a fixed ceiling for their like training, non-training days, that psychologically could reduce stress to a point as it being significant enough for enhanced recovery and enhanced muscle growth. So it would be an indirect effect.
Honestly, I think that that's just a little bit semantic in that sense. Not to say like that argument specifically is semantic, but the idea that you can't, because it's not a fixed ceiling on maintenance either. Especially if you're like estimating your maintenance calories, most people aren't even hitting their target calories for the day exactly every single day. If you are, then I would caution against that because that can really harm your mental health. Sorry.
But that's what bodybuilders do. A lot of bodybuilders do,
Yeah.
right? It's like we're eating 3,346 calories, not 3,350, but it's like exactly this amount. So let's say this person could eat 3,400, 3,300. It's kind of like one day was 4,500. You know,
That's what I mean, is like, if you're saying like, yes, this person is gaining fat over this period of time and eating a flexible diet, okay, how is that any different from eating at maintenance and eating a flexible diet? Because maintenance isn't a bodybuilder strict number, especially if you truly are like trying to gain, where you're not really looking at the scale, you're looking at yourself in the mirror and saying, okay, do I look a little fluffier this week? If I do, I'll just dial back and eat a little bit more salad. But if I don't, then okay, maybe I'm looking a little leaner. Okay, I can be a little bit more flexible this week. And it's not as rigid as people make it out to be. And I think that's one thing that a lot of people tend to make the mistake of thinking is that maintenance diet is almost like a pseudo deficit where you're eating this very strict amount of calories. It's not like that at all. And I think that's the biggest mistake people make when they try to do a main gaining phase or maintaining phase or whatever. I hate the word main gaining, but anybody who's trying to do this, a lot of people make the mistake of treating it like a deficit where they stick to this one single number when that's not really what maintenance is about.
I think perhaps like, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, perhaps the reason why this happens, why there's this like misunderstanding here is because we are approaching maintenance from two different, like entirely different points. Whereas the example that I'm citing depends on us addressing whether you are eating in maintenance on checking your weight on like a weekly average on which it's not going up by anything bigger than 0.1% or going down by 0.1%. So that's about like how tight it usually can get. And then people like John Jewett would even consider a pretty decent surplus to be something like 0.2% a week increase in body weight, which is very small. And I don't think a lot of people would call that a bulk, but it's tied to weight fluctuations, not body composition changes so much.
And I think by that, I would say that if you are truly against maintenance and you think of things in that way, well, then why don't people just cut away all the muscle they gained? Because if they look at weight and eating in a surplus as this, like, it's only about your body weight, why aren't people also doing a muscle cut? Because that is literally like, if they're gaining muscle, that's still body weight. So if you're doing a bulk and a cut and you're going by the traditional definition that all weight that you gain is a surplus, then you would also have to cut muscle too. And that honestly, like, the logic doesn't align well for me, because somebody who, let's say, is losing muscle and gaining fat at the same time and maintaining their body weight is eating in maintenance, according to that definition. Somebody who is gaining muscle and losing body fat is eating in maintenance, according to that definition. And somebody who is not doing either and is just maintaining their entire body composition is also in maintenance. And that, like, when you're in the field of research, you got to be specific about what you're talking about. And if what you're talking about refers to 3 completely different scenarios, something is wrong with what you're talking about in terms of, like, the definitional whatever sense.
Yeah, and I think perhaps one of the things that people who are in the bodybuilding world, they're not realizing is that, just because you're seeing the scale weight increase, it does not mean that you're accumulating fat. It doesn't have to be an accumulation of fat. It could just be that you are actually adding muscle, or just having shifts in nitrogen balance and just water retention and things like that. From my I had surgery a few months ago, and I dropped like 35 pounds after surgery in 2 months. Was pretty freaking sad. But then coming back from surgery, I was eating, the same calories as I was before, and my my skin folds kept getting smaller and smaller. So I basically got to the point where my weight was going up 2.5%, but over the course of 12 weeks, my folds only increased 1 millimeter. So it's like, I would consider that to be pretty darn successful, but still not a definition of a bulk, because like a 1 millimeter is, how really significant is that? That's within the margin of error here. So I could say that I am like bulking, but just because of the amount of weight that it went up, but it's just muscle that was already there that's being regained, and just getting water retention again, and drugs doing drug things. So yeah,
I would also say, like, fat tissue, it does store mainly fat, like, it's pretty much all fat. Muscle tissue stores a lot of water. It's like 70% water. So when you start to gain back muscle through, like, muscle memory, yeah, the weight is going to shoot up really high. And when you have more intramuscular water, you're also changing things in terms of, like, how much fluids you're going to have in total as well. So it's you're getting back your physique, so that makes sense.
Yeah.
Also, I would mention that, at least according, and I find it so funny whenever I pull this, because people say that I'm just speaking semantics, but it is technically, definitionally, a 10% change in body weight over a long period of time is considered, and let me look up the specifics here. Maintenance weight definition. So there's an article on PubMed. It's just a review. And the idea is, so taking all of the factors into consideration, and this is just referring to people who are obese, because a lot of the time when we're talking about weight maintenance, researchers are typically referring to obese individuals or individuals diagnosed with obesity. So just quoting this paper, taking all these factors into consideration, the authors recommend that long-term weight maintenance in adults be defined as a weight change of 3% of body weight. And in the paper, it does give you a specific time period. So if your weight changes by like 1% every single year, that still definitionally is going to be considered weight maintenance, because if your composition is not changing and you're going up that slowly, the amount of weight that you're gaining is negligible, and it's also likely muscle, which is the good kind of weight that people are trying to gain. And if we solely go by surplus equals gain weight, deficit equals lose weight, then there's no way to differentiate muscle weight, muscle loss, fat weight, fat gain, fat loss, and that kind of becomes really complicated to try to like tease out in terms of like that weird definition that is commonly known.
In the enhanced world, I think there's usually an assumption that drugs sort of rewrite the rules entirely for how growth happens. It seems to be pretty much like it's seen by pretty much everyone who is enhanced that the caloric requirement goes up substantially when anabolic androgenic steroids are at play. So say that you could eat 3,000 calories, you add 2 grams of gear, and now you can eat 3,400 calories daily, and still no changes in adding body fat or anything like that. But as far as I know, we don't have any research proving this. So from your understanding, how is it that PEDs actually change the energy equation for muscle growth? In other words, like, do androgens really expand someone's energy budget, in your opinion, or is that just another myth?
I would think that it is partially true. With everything that is claimed, there's always sprinkles of truth mixed among a sea of lies, but I do think that that's mostly true, especially some of the more aggressive anabolics that I've like heard about. And I guess the biggest thing that I would say is that this is all adding to your expenditure. So if you're not gaining any body fat, can you really call it a surplus? And so I guess the best way I could describe it is, let's say you're in the middle of winter and you don't have a heater. So you're shivering like 17 hours a day. Shivering burns a ton of calories. That is kind of akin to what I would see as like, okay, well, you're on all these aggressive compounds that are like increasing anabolic pathways, and anabolic pathways just build up, they build up cells. And when you have a lot of anabolism, that anabolism takes energy. So yeah, you're increasing your energy expenditure. And it's a lot like shivering for 17 hours a day, or it's not like a one-to-one, but it's a lot like it in that sense. At least it's like hypothetical. And I don't think anybody would argue that that person who's shivering 17 hours a day, if they were to eat so much that they don't gain body fat, but they're eating enough to maintain their composition or grow their composition, if let's say they were working out or something, I don't think anyone would call that a surplus because they're shivering. So why would we call it a surplus with people who are on anabolics, who are basically doing the same thing energetically, where they're increasing their energy needs because they're increasing anabolic pathways, basically.
When we're talking about making caloric adjustments for people who, let's say, they're getting a little bit leaner, or they're, in enhanced world, we just say someone's getting harder as opposed to getting softer. What is a small caloric bump for you? Like for me, that's like 2 to 5% increase at a time in calories. In like, we also see the classic like 500 calories a day, which is like legitimately 1 pound of fat a week. So like, it's like by definition. So like, what is it that you like usually go for?
To me, it's less about the scale, it's less about the numbers, and more about how I look and how I feel. So if I notice that my abs are looking a little bit more like they're peeking out a little bit more than usual, I'm feeling really hungry today. Like if I'm in that maintenance phase and I'm like starting to feel really hungry every day, I'm like thinking about food all the time. Okay, maybe it's time to like add in a small snack or a small meal. And that's just because I'm a very small person at like 20% body fat, which is what I'm estimated to be. I'm only carrying 26 pounds of body fat. That is like, that's freak all nothing. So, and you could probably do the math to figure out how much I weigh. But that being said, it's like 26 pounds of body fat is literally nothing. And so how much would it take for me to start gaining fat after I replenish like how much I need to actually eat for the day? Not that much. So am I adding like 2% of what I already eat? Probably not. Am I adding like an apple on days that I feel more hungry? Yeah, that's probably what's going to happen. So I think it just kind of depends on who you are, and it really comes down to playing around with it. So 2 to 5% probably is something that you're seeing that works well for you. Maybe it's 6% for another person who is really active all the time. Maybe it's 1% for that really, really small person who works in an office. So it depends on what your body composition and what your hunger levels look like.
Yeah, no, it absolutely, like you nailed it, because it makes a huge difference on just someone's day job. Like some people, you give them a 20%, a 2% calorie increase, 20%, a 2% calorie increase, and you can visually see, like, from one check into another, it's like you got softer, and it's like, oh shit, like that was not a lot. That's just 2%, but for this person, it is, because it's always context dependent. You know. Would you change how you assess, like being guided primarily by looks, if you were dealing with, let's say, an enhanced person who just holds a fuck ton of water? I'm talking like they become, round with water, and you just like super hard to assess like where they are.
So, fun fact about me, I have something called a redundant colon, which basically means that it's really difficult for me to do any kind of weigh-in. That's just because I have a giant gut. That's so lovely to say out loud, but it's that's I
That how
don't.
you managed to like get your partner? You just put on the app. And it was like, my name is Ella. I'm a scientist. I have a giant gut.
I mean, you can't see it technically,
Yeah.
so I mean, it's not like I have like GH gut, but it's because I'm natural, so it's like I don't have that kind of stuff, but it's like extra long, so it's like really hard for me to like wake up in the morning and be fasted. That's pretty much like the bottom line there. So scale weight, looks wise, like it's almost always never accurate. So what I would recommend for them is figure out a time in the day where you look like you are holding the least water, where you are the most fasted. If it takes fasting during the workday to get there, and that's what I do, is I'll fast during the workday. That's one thing that I would implement. Also, if you're on so much gear that you're looking like a water balloon, it's probably not healthy in the first place.
It's never healthy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's probably like extra like
It depends what the compound is. So for instance, like I could be on 1 gram of testosterone and I really don't hold a lot of water. But if I add 50 milligrams of anadrol, it's like this. Or 20 milligrams of fucking Dianabol. Like that would be so much water. Like I will be able to wake up the next day like 3 pounds heavier.
Does it make a difference for muscle growth for you?
No, not at all. It doesn't make any fucking difference whatsoever. Like the only difference
Just
that it makes is the amount of strength that you gain for those like few hours that that drug is active in your system, but it doesn't make any difference. Yeah.
So I think that my hot take is that do the least amount that's needed for the amount of muscle growth you're trying to
Right.
get.
Right. Right.
So
Right.
like if you can avoid the compounds that make you look watery, that's probably the first thing that I would say to
Yep.
someone who's looking for that. Like
Yep.
if you're looking like a water balloon, okay, let's maybe try something else.
Hmm.
Like if you can avoid that, so that way you don't need to fast all day, so you
Hmm.
don't need to like modulate water on a daily
Hmm.
basis, 'cause that's also not healthy. Then maybe opt for that, just in the
Yep.
name of like living a longer life.
Yeah.
Um, that's what I would
Yeah.
say to that.
No, and I think that's very reasonable. I think that's like the best take, and I that's how I deal with it as well. Even with the point of just like, because outside of like the bros, people don't really see a point in using something that holds a lot of water just for the sake of holding water. It's like, yes, mass moves mass, but we also agree that we're not power lifters. So like, what's the point of saying that mass moves mass?
So I also just would want to push back on that. Mass doesn't move mass. It's muscle mass that moves mass. So fat mass and water mass don't contract. So it's not moving anything. It's just sitting there and making your leverages slightly better, which is
right. That's the
weaker. In a way, it's making you weaker because it's improving your leverages. So you're not even gaining as much muscle on the weight that you used to do. So it's like,
yeah. And we on the point of like also using less drugs, like as little drugs as allows you to do the job. That's how I do it as well. It's just because a healthy body fucking grows better, and also you don't get to die so young, which is it's a pretty good plus. But even like I've actually had fat loss phases where I got GH out of it. Just because I mean, yeah, it's fucking fantastic for fat loss. Like it really is fucking fantastic, but it makes the visual assessment so hard that it's not fucking worth it because I can't tell. And if I can't monitor anything, then what the fuck is the point of tracking, you know? But I have a question here, a little bit more of a theoretical question, even more now. We're just going like deeper into my autistic brain here on just like the Platonic realm. This framework, let's say that we are now not talking about a gym bro who just wants to be big, or a guy who wants to do a local show, or just a regular. Let's say we want to add 70 pounds of muscle instead of just 10 over the next 10 years. Assuming that this rate does slow down and will not hold steadily throughout the entire decade, right? So in the beginning, you get more growth. Would you feed this person at slightly above maintenance or maintenance? I hate even like phrasing it this way because of the whole conversation we just had, but it's the best way that I can come up with. Like, would you basically feed them at the same level as like a natural kid who works a desk job and just wants to be lean for the summer, and an athlete that wants to step on the Olympia stage over the next 4 years alike? Would the strategy for feeding them be the same?
Are they gaining that 70 pounds in 4 years?
No. But they're gaining it over the course of 10 years, and let's say that it's slowing down. So let's say on the first year it goes to like 3%, then it goes to 2, then 1, then 0.5, then 0.2, and 0.1.
Okay, well, even if they are gaining 70 pounds over the course of like, so wait, so they're gaining 70 pounds over the course of 10 years, not
actually,
4?
that's actually solid to do the math.
I'm just making sure that they're not gaining like 70 pounds in 4 years, because that's not
No.
physiological.
So 70 pounds by 10 years, so 7 pounds a year.
Okay. So then what I'll say is multiply that by 0.1, and that's the amount of like dry weight muscle protein, or at least here, wait, actually not 0.1.
0.7.
Let's do let's be generous and say 0.4. So if I did
7 times 0.4, that's 2.8.
No, 70. So the whole 70 pounds multiplied by 0.4. And that's the dry
0.
Yeah.
Oh, 0.4.
Yeah, 28.
That would be that was like being real generous about how much of that weight is actually muscle protein. Because typically it's between like 20, maybe it gets up to 40. And actually, I don't even know. Hold up. Let me make sure that I'm saying this correctly. Percent of muscle tissue that is contractile. No, not finished. That's not what I'm trying to find. That is protein.
Just because it's like from like just seeing what we normally see, it's like it's not uncommon for someone to put 30 pounds in their first year,
so
and that being like muscle.
Okay, so I just found the exact number. So muscle tissue by weight is 70% 70% water, 20% protein, and then the rest of it can be like glycogen and whatever else in there.
Mm-hmm.
So what you would do is you do 70 pounds times 0.2, and that's the amount of pounds of dry weight muscle protein that you would need energy for to build, and you would need the resources to build. So protein plus the energy to actually build that muscle, that's how many pounds you're actually gaining in terms of how much energy do I need to gain that. Because water, not really that energetically like expensive to push into a cell, especially if it's like favorable because you have a ton of glycogen in there. Because glycogen, I believe it's like every 1 gram of glycogen holds 3 grams of water. So naturally, you're going to have a lot of water in the muscle cell. And glycogen is something that you get and lose on a daily basis. So that's not what you're talking about when you say you're gaining 70 pounds of muscle. That's not all muscle protein. That's not all things that you need energy to build up and then maintain around. So in reality, you're saying 70 pounds of muscle tissue, yes, but that's 14 pounds worth of muscle proteins that you need energy for. And 14 pounds is a lot lower than 70. And so I would argue that I wouldn't put him into a straightaway surplus, especially if he's already at a healthy body fat percentage. That's a really big key there. If he's at a body fat he enjoys and he feels healthy at, I would say eat as much as you need to feel good throughout the day. And so that way you're not also gaining an absurd amount of body fat over a period of time. If he gains a little bit, I don't care. But if he's gaining like enough that it's noticeable after like a month, then I'm going to say like, okay, dial it back. But the idea is eat enough that you feel good and that you're maintaining relatively around the body fat percentage that is healthy for him, that he enjoys being at. Once you get there, he's going to gain muscle at that same rate because you can't force muscle to grow. It's going to grow based off of how much you're lifting. And I think that's the approach that I would take for that person. Because at the end of that, they'll still gain that 70 pounds of muscle tissue or the 14 pounds of muscle protein. They're just not gaining it with the cycling fat thing that doesn't really matter.
So I guess they would just say that their energy requirement is just different, so that if the visuals are still showing that they're lean and not getting fat, then they're still eating an appropriate amount. It just, the only thing that changes is the degree or the amount that it changes. So we could even put an example of like some people that have existed, that have like walked the face of the earth, where they were started at like 150 pounds and they became like 320 pounds. It's like over the course of like, say, 12 years. Insane, like ridiculous, but it could still be done within the same calculation. It would be like less than 30 pounds overall. And you would still be basically assessing the body fat levels with the just perhaps like a caliper site as well, or something like that, to keep like a tight look over it. And not really have to push like a caloric surplus to the extent that they gain body fat.
I have a question. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I also just wanted to clarify. When I gave that 14 pounds, that's just like a visual of how much energy you really need for that. Because 70 pounds makes it sound like you need a lot of energy for it, when most of that 70 pounds is glycogen and water. There's only a small fraction of it that's actually protein that you need energy for. And you can get that energy without going into a surplus. That's like the main point of what I was saying. I hope that got across.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think it did. I'm just like, of course, being a sponge over here and learning so much. But what I find interesting is, like, as you're talking about practically, taking the studies and then putting them into practice, I feel like a lot of the judgment calls on, should I eat more? Should I eat less? What is my body fat like, is based off of perception or your own, I'm looking in the mirror, I'm looking at what I look like, or how do I feel, or am I hungrier? And it's not as detailed with the, specific, I'm eating, 3,050 calories a day right now, and I got to hit that specific number. But then you're referring to all of these studies that, of course, have to be very specific, and you're like from the science world, and that contrast is so interesting to me. And I'm just wondering how that fits together. Like, is that typically how you always have carried out your research in real life, I guess?
So I'm a bench researcher, meaning I do a lot of in vitro, in vivo stuff. That's what I've primarily focused on. The one laboratory that I've worked with humans in, I actually don't, I'm not in human research because I prefer bench work for its specificity and the way that it is. But all of these studies, I hate to break anybody's heart who's watching this, but human research is not specific at all. It is the most, you're throwing a dart and it's like maybe hitting the rim. And that's a lot of human research because it's unethical to control human to control humans super heavily. So you can control mice like up to the thing of like, okay, do I want their circadian rhythm to be reverse or to be like ours? Like you can literally change their circadian rhythm by moving the light switch and like keeping it a certain time and like feeding them a specific diet. You can even
I can't be the only one who wants to do that with people, though.
Oh,
you know?
my God.
At IRB boards would be after you. But that's so a lot of the human research isn't specific. And that's part of the reason why I'm like, I'm not taking a specific approach, because even with our own day-to-day lives, there's a 20% error margin on the FDA nutrition labels. So you can't even be that accurate. So why are you trying to be when you can just look in the mirror, look at how you're performing? Because at the end of the day, the most accurate thing you're going to get is not with the FDA's 20% food margin, like food label margin, error margin. It's going to be in the gym. How much are you progressing every time you go into the gym? If you're not progressing, it doesn't matter how many calories you're forcing down your throat. You're still going to not progress. And that's not going to change until you change your training, until you maybe up your protein intake. But the amount of calories you're eating isn't going to affect that. So that's why I focus more on like performance. I focus more on like how you're feeling, because that's what's going to drive you to go to the gym in the first place. It's not the amount of calories you're eating, because that like I always have a picture of that like teenage kid at the end of the night guzzling down a mass gainer shake. That's not doing anything for your
I did that. I got pretty fat, man. I was skinny fat, and I just got like fat.
I did that too at one point, and it was like it doesn't do anything. So it's like I don't want to like promote that, because it's also like I had disordered eating habits for a while, and it was like eating at maintenance and acknowledging that I'm not going to always have it accurately is what got me out of that mindset in the first place. So yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Interesting. We should have a conversation about that, because I deal with that a lot with like clients and stuff, and it's a sort of a special interest of mine, studying disordered eating, because it runs in the family, so to speak, and it's also like not even therapists sometimes want to touch this thing with people. So it's very complex, so it just makes me interested by default. But in any case, to piggyback off this question, like you're literally as like at this crossroads of research and experience when it comes to the the lifting world. How do you think like we can basically be guided by science, influenced by science, without turning into worshiping science? And I think the biggest example that can come to mind right now, it's the people that come to mind when we say science-based lifting, that have basically extrapolated the data and then dogmatized it. Like, how is it that we avoid that when we are having conversations about caloric intake and hypertrophy, hyperplasia, all of those types of things?
Remember that science is a method. It's not a religion, and that is so big. So like when I went through the literature on bulking, because when I first watched, like, for example, Jeff Nippard's video on bulking and cutting, I was like, oh, I got to read these studies. They must be like really supporting bulking for him to make a video on it. I read them and I'm like, this study is crap. Like it's genuinely horrible. So it's really important to remember the conclusion of a paper, the abstract of a paper, that doesn't tell you about the substance of a paper. And a lot of the times in science, and this is another thing that kind of goes into health science, is people think that scientists are these mad scientists with toxic substances all over their lab coats, just hungry for industry money. That's not true at all. There's two types of scientists, academia and industry. Now, yes, there is some bias in academia. I would be lying if I said otherwise. But industry scientists too, as well as academia scientists, we do publish. And when you do publish, falsifying data carries a really heavy punishment. So the most common thing you see with scientists is not falsification of data. So the funding doesn't matter. And the most common thing is you'll see it in the study methods and you'll see it in the analysis, because a greedy, bad scientist will design a dog shit study and p-hack the living hell out of it, conduct tens, like probably like I saw one study that had 120 different unpaired t-tests. So they'll do those sorts of things. They won't falsify data. But if you're able to catch those things, you can just disregard the study because it's a bad study. Yeah. It's done by a biased scientist. We're all human.
That doesn't happen though, because people don't even know how to read those sections of the papers though. You know, it's very hard because it's one of those things that, you know, in the religion world, we always ask the question of, like, even within Protestantism, the question is asked of, but was it a good thing, the fact that everyone has access to this? Because it's just a bunch of people that don't understand how much they don't understand that now have access to this thing. And it can just be so easy to just be like, but it's written. It's clear. The abstract is clear. The conclusion is clear. Like, who would write a conclusion that doesn't actually come from the analysis section, right? Like, that wouldn't happen, right? Like, we wouldn't say that it supports something that it doesn't or something like that. So it's just like, how can we even avoid data? Like, even, is it possible to avoid? Is this just all goes back to the job of like having to constantly be educating grown ass adults who think they know better? Like, how does this work?
I would say I'd say 3 or 4 different points on that. The first one is trust the people who know how to actually analyze the papers. Like I don't. You don't need to trust everything I say because I'll like highlight it and I'll like put the screenshot up there. But at least understand that when I say, like, for example, the most recent example of this is like has nothing to do with the conversation, but it's the most recent example is this kid using ChatGPT saying that a PCA, which is a type of principal component analysis, is the same thing as a structure plot, which is a different type of analysis. He was trying to say they were the same thing. And I'm like, they're not. They're literally 2 different types of analytical techniques. It doesn't matter like how many times you chat GPT it, it's never going to be the same. So that sort of thing, like, don't use chat GPT to confirm your bias. That's
ever, period. Just don't use chat GPT.
Don't do it. It never ends well. Trust the people when they say, trust the people who have qualifications and people who are in the field and know, like, when they point out something like this analytical technique is not that one, at least listen to that. Like, you don't need to listen to everything they say, but if they say that, like, this is not that, you can even Google that yourself and you'll probably find something that supports the same thing on the general gist of it. So there's that part. And then don't just believe every study you see. So always look at it as a critical eye, because the conclusion section typically is the scientist trying to say, hey, this is a really clinically relevant finding. You should publish my work. Because otherwise you don't get your paper published. Like, most journals require your paper to be in like the top, I believe it's top 20% of papers that peer reviewer has read. So if it's not in the top 20%, it gets rejected or it gets sent back for major revision. So you want to have a really, really like novel, new finding, crazy good paper. So you need to make the conclusion sound like it's clinically relevant, even if maybe it's not. So try to take the conclusions and the abstract with a grain of salt and read the study. And like, if you can find the full text, then find the full text. If you can't, then go and trust the person who actually can tell the difference between a PCA and a box plot, or PCA and a structure plot.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like what the hard thing for people to hear is like immediately when we say the word trust, it's almost like they hear that as have faith in this person like blindly. And I just don't think that's the case. When I went to get my bachelor's, I was not going to study philosophy. I wanted to become a pastor, right? And I'm there in my philosophy class, and we're debating all of these things that in my mind I was like, this doesn't have anything to do with religion. This is just whatever. It's useless. Like philosophy is useless. Can you imagine? My professor just obliterated me, because I was like the kid that was like, always debating the instructor or something like that. So there was an instance in which the professor wasn't there, so it was a sub, and I grilled the fuck out of the sub, and I was right, but still the professor was like, "You want to know what smart feels like? I'm going to show you what dumb feels like," and like destroyed me. And from that day on, like I basically had the humility to say, you know what? I'm just going to, for the next 5 years, pretend or live as if this guy that has 2 PhDs and is currently getting a third one, all in unrelated fields, perhaps knows a thing or two more than me. Like, maybe. And let's just see what happens, right? And of course, I ended up learning a fuck ton and just like leaving college realizing that, fuck, I don't know shit about anything, So I feel like if there was more, and this is probably a mean thing to say, but I'm not a nice person. If there was a way to like get people to really understand how much is it that we don't know, I found that in my life to have a positive outcome. I know that people are reluctant to it, but just perhaps putting yourself in an environment where that can happen, where when you make a comment about science, is not just the Thanksgiving table to your aunt and uncle, but it's perhaps in a group with people that are actual scientists, so that you can hear their side of the story as well. Like be in conversation with the stuff that you're talking about, instead of just acting as if it's an object that doesn't have real people with real like emotions, feelings, and aspirations, and all of these things, and organizations and stuff like that.
Yeah, I would be the first person to say that I also don't know shit about shit. Yeah, no, it's science is like, it's this field that's ever growing. It's the reason why I love it so much, is because you're always finding out something that you didn't know the day before. When it comes to like, you do an experiment, you look at the results. Oh, I didn't know that. That's so cool. And so I find it really interesting in that regard. But it's like, I think trust was also kind of the wrong word. It's not just trust. It's trust with evidence. So it's like, you're not only trusting or having faith in the person, you're trusting them because they showed you this evidence. So like when I say like a PCA and I show you the actual like plot of what a PCA looks like, and then I align that next to a structure plot, you see they're two completely different graphs. They use completely different analytical techniques. One uses something called a K value, the other one does not. It doesn't rely on like pre-structured groupings. And like when you do that, that's like trusting me with evidence. I gave you the evidence for why you should trust me, and I also gave you the interpretation of it. And I think that's I enjoy a lot of the science communicators on TikTok and Instagram, because that's what they do is they'll bring up the study, they'll bring up like the evidence that you can go and find for yourself. But it's important to trust people who actually do that and don't just flash up ChatGPT conversations.
Yeah, and I feel like another good word that you could use to describe it is putting value on the person's argument or opinion or whatever they're communicating. It's like you should hold certain things that you say, for example, in higher value than something that I might say, about this topic, because of because of your background and because of everything that you've studied. I have request / question. When you were talking about the papers and how, you shouldn't just look at the conclusion or the abstract, you should read the actual paper. And then I was like, oh yeah, you should. And then I was like, but what am I looking for? Like, what are the red flags that I'm looking for in the study that are going to show?
We actually have a podcast for that. Do you remember that?
Oh yeah, I remember. Yes, I do remember that.
Yeah. Let's just record that thing eventually so that people learn how to read papers, because that's actually a good point.
But okay, shortened version then, because I'm not patient enough.
Yeah, it's like what do you like people look for? Like, what are the red flags in a study?
Or what are like 3 tips for the me that's not reading these on always, but maybe I want to start reading papers now that I've talked to you.
So for somebody who's just getting started, I would say figure out a field that you're really interested in. And then I would look for a narrative review in one of the higher impact journals. So the top 3 would be Cell, Nature, and Science. Those are some really high impact, really reputable journals. So if you find a narrative review there, you're gonna, I'll put money down that it's a pretty damn good review. And so it's probably pretty like well revered by other people in that profession, and that you can probably put a little bit more trust into that than something that's like in some shady back alley journal that like doesn't do good practices for peer review.
Mm-hmm.
So find a narrative review in a good reputable journal, Nature, Cell, Science, and then you're going to go through that entire review and look up every single word you don't understand. And so you're going to read through it. Let's say I'm looking through a journal on cardiolipin inside of the inner mitochondrial membrane. I don't understand what cardiolipin is. Let me go Google that. Let me go look up inner mitochondrial membrane. I don't understand that.
That is a good use of ChatGPT.
That is a good use of ChatGPT if you want to understand like the basics of what words mean. So that's what I would go for first. And then after that, then I would go for, let's say, a randomized control trial. So let's say after you read through that study on cardiolipin and the inner mitochondrial membrane, you want to look at how an unsaturated fat diet affects that kind of like lipid composition in the cell. Then I would look for a randomized control trial looking at that and how it affects, like, let's say, mitochondrial efficiency or something. And then I would do the same thing I did with that randomized control trial, is I would refer back to that review and go through everything I learned from that review and apply it to that randomized control trial. And every single time I bump into something I don't know, whether it's a method or a specific analytical technique, Google it, look it up, figure out how it works. And then you can determine, okay, what are other methods that are used for this randomized control trial? And then I'll compare them. So let's say there's one that's considered gold standard and that randomized control trial doesn't use it. That'll make me question the integrity of that randomized control trial. And then let's say I get to the analytical point, and this is more so something that you would need to like take a statistics class for, but I'll just say it. If you have a lot of tests that are being run, so let's say they run independent t-tests for like every single variable, and there's like 20 of them, you're more likely to get a more significant result, and that significant result might be false. So it's something called p-hacking, where you're like massaging the data to push out a more significant result. Another example of this would be like, let's say they use a t-test that assumes that the standard deviations are the same, even though they're different. That's massaging the data to push out something that's more significant. Because if you assume that standard deviations aren't the same, that undergoes a completely different round of analysis, that the formulas are not the same. You're going to pop out with different p-values, which result in different levels of significance. And in layman's terms, that means the data is when you don't assume that standard deviation is the same, that's going to make your results look less valuable. While when you do assume they're the same, that makes them look more valuable.
It's like the same thing that you do when you're writing a resume but have no job experience. And you massage the data of whatever you've done to make it look like you've done more than you've done. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or when you need to get grant money.
Yeah, when you run multiple tests and you don't have any like Bonferroni corrections or any other kind of correction technique, when you're not accounting for like standard deviations being different or anything like that, those are red flags that maybe you might not be able to see, but if you take a screenshot of it and run that through ChatGPT, I will say ChatGPT is, and specifically DeepSeek, is fantastic at math. So if you push it through there, you can ask it, hey, are the standard deviations for this data the same? And usually you'll find extra data in the supplementary material. So if the study doesn't mention it, that also is kind of a red flag. 'Cause I usually like to see the data that I'm looking at, but sometimes they don't mention it because it's like too long. So if the data is too long, look for supplementary material and then run that through ChatGPT. And that's what I'll do for some things if it's really like complex math that I just don't understand or have time for.
That's great. The way that I usually tell people, it's like, if you want to jump into this, like start by going tertiary, secondary, primary sources. So just read like a broad introduction to biology, and then go to you liked one specific area of biology, just read a monograph on that subject. And then whenever you find a chapter that is really, really interesting and stuff, after you're done reading it, pick some papers out of that you like saw that were interesting, and then start doing this. Like that's essentially how I've come to learn like everything that I've come to learn. It's always just the footnotes. That's the most important thing. So you go like footnote to footnote to footnote to footnote, just like chasing this thing around until you find answers. And like if you go that way, or the way you're suggesting, it's just, you're going to realize how long it takes to know something. It takes a really long time to understand something. And there's a book by Martin Adler called How to Read a Book, and I would recommend anyone to read that book. He basically goes into like a full methodology for reading. But one of the things that I do whenever I'm reading anything that I would like to eventually like teach or explain to someone is I just immediately try to teach. And I can catch myself saying like, ooh, I don't know, like, is it like protein breakdown or is it protein synthesis? And it's like, okay, so I don't understand that shit yet. So I go back and just look that up, and keep going back until you can explain something so well that someone who's in the field would be like, wow, that's actually a great way of putting it. Like, I'm surprised you were able to put it that way. It's like, then you understood it. And until that point, you don't understand. You're just parroting, so to speak. Yeah.
If you're looking for really simple papers also, Stat Pearls. Stat Pearls is a fantastic online like source that you can look through. They usually have like these really brief online textbook pages on like very like pretty niche topics that are really simplified down, like to the point where like an intro level like bio undergrad student could probably understand it. So it's pretty good. I would highly recommend Stat Pearls. And then there's a few YouTube channels that I've watched myself personally when I was first getting into like biological signaling. I would say JJ Medicine, and there's this other one I don't remember, but he's got a pretty thick Indian accent, but he's got some really good content. You probably will see his content alongside JJ Medicine's. So highly recommend those I guess simple sources too. But narrative reviews are like kind of like that monograph that you were talking about.
For the coaches and for the athletes who want to be evidence-based but still want to be flexible with understanding the limitations of science and scientific method as a whole, or something like that, what is like your piece of advice for them on this?
The thing about science is it's really about building on itself. So very rarely will you find these major breakthroughs that completely reverse the field. So when, for example, the science-based, and I put that in quotations, people were saying that high volume, low intensity was building as much muscle as high intensity, low volume. And that's like referring to training styles. That's when I was like scratching my head for a second, because I was like, but intensity has been found time and time and time and time again to contribute primarily to muscle growth. It's like one of the strongest predictors that you're going to grow muscles if you train intensely and you train close or at failure. So saying the opposite of that makes no freaking sense. And most of the time, you need some really astounding literature to turn around a field like that. So, and this is on the basis of like also accounting for both mechanistic and outcome data in terms of like humans. So mechanical tension, that's primarily related to how intense you're training. That's considered the primary driver of muscle growth. Most of the outcome data says that training intensely increases muscle mass far more than not training intensely. So why are they saying the opposite? That's when you should start questioning the quote unquote the science religious people, because that's 9 times out of 10 they're wrong, because science builds on itself. It rarely breaks down and then rebuilds. So if you hear something that is surprising and shocking, do some more digging. That's like the sign to do more digging and not to start hopping on that train. Do more digging, confirm that what you're looking at is truly a shocking, groundbreaking technique or groundbreaking result, then you can move forward with it. But if it's just some groundbreaking science that sounds like it's breaking apart an entire field, probably not good.
Yep. That's that actually holds true for I'm pretty sure every field. There is research in it, just because the method is still the same. If you're just discovering something that no one caught it before, everyone is like how real is it if no one really like seen it before? Like, are you that bright? Could be the case. That's why we review papers and you know and we like go back and forth, but usually it isn't.
Yeah, repeatability. That's like the biggest thing in science. If it's repeatable, then you got something there and you can keep exploring. But if you keep on trying to go down the same route to the point where it looks like you're beating a dead horse because the horse is not moving and not breathing and there's no other evidence of it actually being true, you're just beating a dead horse. You're not actually doing anything.
Plus, these things usually generate quite a bit of noise within the field itself. So, like, one of the things that I always found weird in the whole like science and lifting is how we'll get a paper and just be like, this paper is really showing this thing. But you don't really find people within that field interacting with this paper. There's no one writing like multiple reviews of this thing. But there's also like no volumes that have been published celebrating the research of this person or like marking it as these things happen. But why is it that they don't happen with these studies that we hold in this case? Like, why is it that they just seem shocking to people who are not in the field? Like, that always is just like, what? That doesn't make any freaking sense. But in any case, Ella, is there like something that like still like holds you, like keep you awake at night? There's like, I really want to figure this thing out within like anything related to like hypertrophy or muscle growth, dieting, fat loss, and things like that?
I want to know how calveolae play a role in hypertrophy.
What is this?
Badly. Okay, so basically, I literally just learned about this in my biochem class. Just for like, this has been keeping me up at night because I've been really wanting to know more. And I'm actually going to do more research into it later on, hopefully. But basically, your cell membranes, like for every cell in your body, they don't really change in size when they contract. So what happens when your muscle cells contract and there's a lot of tension and stress on them? Well, they form these little divots called calveolae. And calveolae, they're like invaginations into the cell membrane, kind of like T-tubules, but you also get them when you're just contracting muscle tissue. Because like, what are you doing with all that extra like cell membrane? Are you just like, is it just going poof when you contract your muscle? No, it's folding up. So a lot of tissues that have a lot of tension like muscle will have these calveolae, and they serve sometimes for signaling. So I'm curious if they play a role in hypertrophy and like in signaling for hypertrophy. And I'm sure there's research out there that shows that they do. I'm curious about the specifics about it because I want to know everything there is to know about skeletal muscle physiology. I think it's so cool. So right now, that's what's been keeping me up at night. I'm sure if you come back to me in like 3 weeks, I'll probably have like 5 papers that I've already read on it. And now I'm on to like some other thing that's niche in the same field. But
Nice.
That's really
Nice.
cool.
I like that word too, calviole. I
I do too.
I like it.
Calviolae are formed by proteins called calviolin.
Oh wow. See, it just works, man. I like the sound of it. I want to see Marcus saying that calviole went on a meme next time. Ella, this conversation has been phenomenal. Thank you so much. You've managed to take so much like something that everyone thinks they understand and rebuild it from the ground up with data, with nuance, with common sense. And what I respect the most is that you don't just challenge people, which goes back to a little bit of what I feel like doing with people, but you also you invite them to learn, which is how I think things should actually work when I get my emotions out of the picture. You've raised the standard, in my opinion, for what evidence-based coaching should look like. So really, really thankful for that.
And for anyone who wants to follow Ella's work and keep up with her research and myth busting, where can they find you online?
At Scientific Snitch on pretty much every platform. Also, I can send over the studies, specifically that flexible and rigid dieting one.
Yeah.
And all the other ones that I referred to, I can just pile them up into an email.
Nice. I would love that. And I'll put that in the description. To everyone listening, thank you guys for being part of the OptiLab community. If this episode challenged you in the way that you think about growth, about nutrition, or the word bulking itself, share with a friend, drop a like, make sure you're subscribed. Your engagement helps these conversations reach more people who actually care about the evidence over the tradition just for tradition's sake. And Ella, seriously, thank you for your time. Thank you for your clarity. Thank you for your courage to question what everybody just keeps repeating. And you're one of the sharpest minds in the space, man. And we're really honored to have you here. And we'll be back another week with another conversation about optimizing not just the body, but the human experience as a whole. Until then, you guys stay disciplined, stay curious, and keep evolving. Peace.